You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent, Fleskens, your host as always, and don't we have a cracker of an episode for you today. I'm lucky enough to have got my good mate Luke Parker to spare a couple of hours of his time this morning to have a conversation about how his recent apartment development, Montreal Commons in Fremantle, which is just finished up, has gone. It's a really insightful, interesting and candid conversation we're about to have about all the details, good and bad. Luke's been very generous to offer us transparent information as he can today about his journey over the last 5 or 6 years with Montreal Commons, a really fantastic apartment building that's come out of the ground in Fremantle, and most importantly, most poignantly, one of the only apartment buildings to come out of the ground in Western Australia in the last couple of years. Bigger than 5 or 6 apartments and not as big as a Blackburn development that supports its own ecosystem. So today, Luke, I really appreciate your time, mate.
Morning, Trent. No pressure for this one.
Yeah, mate, I think so many people are going to listen to this because a lot of people have watched from via LinkedIn or just in the market your progress with this development and looking at it going, well, geez, it's obviously been a bit of a ride for you through COVID for most people. And whilst most developers have mothballed their projects over the last few years, you actually got yours out of the ground, got a builder to commit and got all those sales through to the end and looking to move on to the next stage of that development. You're not just a developer though, you're a development manager as well at OP Property, and you're also the chair of the residential committee at PCA. So you've clearly got a lot of oversight and also you spend a lot of time helping the industry with your insights as to what's going on right now. So after the chat about Montreal Commons as a case study, it'd be great if we can have a chat about the market too.
Absolutely, Trent. It's great to be able to contribute. The property industry across Australia is strained, Western Australia in particular, and the shortfall in supply across housing, across infill is really ever increasing. So appreciate it's such an important topic that's great to be able to contribute to.
Let's get straight into it and let's go back to the genesis of this project if we can. At the time, what year was it? What were you looking for and how did this opportunity come about?
Late 19, we purchased a site off Development WA. The site itself is within the East Village Knutsford precinct, which is a highly sustainable precinct in Fremantle with the oversight of Development WA. But as everyone will know, late 19 was just before COVID. So
darkest days of the property market at the time.
It was, look, we, of course, no one wants to know across the board, but we were really at what was then the tail end of almost a 10-year going sideways / decline across Perth. There was a few times throughout 2017, 2018 that we all were expecting things to bounce a bit in terms of improving in that sector. And so we thought the fundamentals were looking pretty good, and we were on the lookout with our client to purchase an apartment site, which ended up being this one in Fremantle.
What did you like about it? What was the location before it became this rezoned area?
It's in an area of Fremantle which is covered by a large structure plan which is looking to regenerate some of the housing stock there. It has a history of light industrial. It still is a relatively unknown pocket. It's opposite the golf course on the corner of Montreal and Knutsford Street for those that might be familiar with the suburb. And Development WA is building out 36 townhouses neighbouring the site.
So they were getting on with that anyway?
Yeah, correct. They'd already commenced, subdivided, and a number had commenced construction.
Why didn't they get a developer to develop those 36? Why did they go ahead and do it themselves?
I think because it was more of a subdivision development, there was a bit more an inclination to subdivide. It probably gave them a bit more control over the outcomes of the subdivision and allowed what was then the first stage.
So setting the tone really for the precinct.
Of the precinct to get going.
Yep.
And so I think probably those factors came into play in terms of running it themselves. And then the other two sites are part of what is the first stage. The one is Montreal Commons, which is, of course, the topic of this discussion that's just been completed. And next door, OP's purchased a site next door, which is looking like townhouses. So that rounds out the precinct. But then the wider structure plan does cover more land out to the west of that site.
What did you pay for the site? Was it a very competitive bid at the time, or were people pretty gun-shy about getting into a purchase in such a new area in Fremantle at the time?
Oh, look, I don't think there's a huge appetite across the board from investors and developers to be buying apartment sites in 2019. I think about 1.5 we paid for it.
So not breaking the bank when it comes to an apartment development
Not
site.
breaking the bank, but as is typical with Development WA development sites, they come with their buyback provisions. And so it's a layer as a developer, which is increased risk because while they're not often exercised, we couldn't buy the land to land bank, which would have been the strong preference at the time. We had to buy it with a delivery strategy pretty well worked out. so that we had the confidence to actually get on with it, get into construction, and we weren't at risk of the project stalling, which then may have exposed us to the potential buyback provisions. And so I think that definitely influences the land value, because as the developer, you haven't got that as many fallback positions as you might if it was just a more typical freehold site.
I remember early days when you'd announced that you purchased a site, you were starting to go through planning. It seemed like you had a fairly cordial relationship with the city of Fremantle at the time. You were looking to break the mold a little bit with Green Star rating and those sort of things. So what was the headline there, and how did the experience go on the planning side? I guess this was pre-COVID still?
That was into 2020. On the onset of COVID, we had to sit down with the board and have a really serious look at what do we do? Do we keep going?
We had no idea what was happening.
We were in the midst of this pandemic breaking out, and in the middle of it was pretty dire. And from an investment point of view, do we push on? Do we hold? We looked at it, and we looked at the fundamentals, and we ultimately decided to push on with the design and planning approvals. We didn't know when or how the pandemic was going to end, but we knew that we would come out of it at some point. So we decided to push on. Equally, with our involvement with another client delivering aged care facility in Maddington for Mercy Care, there were similar, very challenging points of time where we just need to look at the fundamentals and work closely with the boards to ultimately push on with land preparation works. Not knowing exactly when we might be able to commence, but looking at it that at some point we will.
Yep. So we may as well just get on with it.
Get on with it, because it's 12 months of design development and the like. Look, overall, I think we would view a really positive relationship with the City of Fremantle.
Were they proactive about being a part of a team here and facilitating a great outcome? How was the cultural experience?
Absolutely. I think at the same time, during the assessment process, during the design advisory process, the pressure was put on to deliver the best possible outcomes. So a lot of back and forth through that stage. Ultimately, the council provided unanimous approval, which, while going to JDAP, is a pretty rare event. And so really pleased with that. And dialogue with the city, really from an outcome point of view, is, I think, generally quite positive.
Good. So really big ticks there on the planning side, that they really wanted to be a part of that vision.
Yeah, I think the structure plan set a good framework. It also allowed the community time to understand what the plan was for that area. I think often there can be a vision for infill, and a developer buys a site, lodges a DA, and then the community is going, well, hang on a second, I didn't realize there's going to be an apartment building there.
Yeah, it's a big shirt front.
Yeah, so for whatever reason, they may not kind of be as aware of that strategic planning. So I think the structure plan was in play for a number of years. I think there was an understanding of that there's going to be more height, and that it was appropriate within reason. And that, I guess, gave us a bit more to work with as the developer. Push height, we were able to get a bit of height concessions because of the sustainability outcomes and the high design quality by our architect, Hillam Architects, to ultimately get the development approved and then, move forward.
So the reality is, you're going through acquisition, you've gone through planning, not including the acquisition cost. Before we even start talking about sales and marketing, you've already invested a few $100,000 at this point in time.
Well upwards of that. You need to move these projects, well, you don't need to, but decisions made to move the projects forward. They're pretty chunky projects, and you've got to invest in that. And it's substantial, the funds, to get your planning approval. But then, of course, you get your approval, you need to be looking very closely at how you're going to build, how you're going to market. And so at the same time of the design development, we're in discussion with our quantity surveyor and a discussion with different builders that we may have earmarked as wanting to tender on the project. And our sales and marketing team was very actively involved. Every project, we'll review the scheme. Like, we went out to the projection studio where we projected each apartment floor plan on a 1-to-1 scale.
Really getting a feel for what the experience will be for the buyer.
We wheeled the furniture around. We walked through each apartment. We tweaked walls. We did all of that.
Not many developers would do that.
It's so critical. Little changes make such a difference to the feel and the livability. From a end user point of view, ultimately, we're building people's homes. They need to be functional. They need to be comfortable. And you walk in and think, this is really thought out. I think those different layers and checks are critical. From a project risk point of view, there's so much concept plan working. We would have done 30 or 40 revisions of the initial concept plan. And you do one cut, and then you say, well, if we can tweak this, this, and this, we might get another 60 square meters overall. If you're selling your stock at $8,000 a meter, there's an extra $500,000 of revenue that's come in. Yes, there's a bit of construction cost in there as well, but...
Well, that can be the difference between a project starting and stopping. And
Yeah,
this
correct.
is the interesting thing. I'm assuming at this point in time, we're in 2020, your biggest risk concern was not construction costs, because it hadn't started moving yet.
No.
It was your ability to sell these things at a price that would have made it stack up, right?
Correct.
Quite ironic, isn't it? Given where we are today.
It absolutely, and things do change, and you have to be flexible with that. But spot on, and that's where knowing we'd have to market and get pre-sales to commence construction, we had to be spot on. You got to get the 1%ers right, and that's at every stage. I think equally, you got to get that. Whether it's Queen's Surveyor, builders' feedback early on. There's no point getting a job approved, and then you go to tender and you just can't afford the project.
When we think about the sales and marketing time, you just referenced it really. Let's segue into it. How much time did you allow to get enough pre-sales?
Look, it was probably at least a 6-month outlook from proper launch to getting close to 100% debt coverage.
And how many apartments would that have been?
So 39 apartments plus the commercial units of 40. I think we needed about 24, 25.
Okay, so candid question here. If you didn't have to wait that 6-ish months to get pre-sales going, regardless of the contemporaneous time of where we were at that point in time, do you think that would have helped bring the project costs down, project risks down, given obviously costs were about to escalate massively? Or do you think it would have ironically put the builder into a point where maybe this project may not have even been able to be finished, given the price you probably would have been able to lock in 6 months earlier?
Absolutely is the short answer. 6 months, it's not just 6 months, is it going to be 4, is it going to be 8 months? So in today's contracting environment where things are volatile, to do that again now is just, it's one of the big factors as to why projects, you got 80% of apartments across Perth are currently on hold. You get your designs, you get your approval, go to 1 or 2 builders. First of all, there's hesitation and a bit of reluctance to actually price the job in the first place.
Well, there's hardly any builders to go to as well.
Yeah, correct. It's sort of, the builders need to make a decision around, do they invest, or, their estimating team price a job. If your client hasn't got the pre-sales, well, then I might just go price a civic centre or an industrial unit instead.
I'm going to spend a lot of time pricing this,
Yep.
and it might not even go ahead.
I'll make the same margin.
Yep.
It's the same quantum. One's less complicated and more certain to proceed. So that's a big factor. So in today's market, then it was a real factor. Now it's a massive factor. And that's where one of the policy suggestions put forward by Property Council in the run-up to the state election is looking at whether there might be the potential for the government at a state level to replicate this small business guarantee scheme that was done during COVID, but apply that where the state government may provide form of guarantee to the banks.
Emily Young spoke about this a few weeks ago.
Yeah, to allow the banks to then fund projects at much lower pre-sales.
This is a huge idea that is really only required because banks have their pre-sales policy. If the banks were to roll over on this policy in the first place, or at least just relax it, the government wouldn't have to step in. So it would even be a case where maybe the first port of call is simply getting the government to sit around the table with the big 4 banks and say, guys, come on, like you're killing us here. I find it so ironic, and I know this is a digression, that we always tip our cap out to the government for assistance, when really a lot of the problems that exist in terms of the risk in this market when it comes to funding finance policy originates with the banks. We just don't ever think to actually ask the banks, hey, can you do a better job?
Oh, look, sure. I think the pre-sale criteria from the banks is dropping quite rapidly. So I'm hearing reports of 70s, 60s, even 50% pre-sale coverage. So I think it's definitely coming back. But I think at the same time, the banks are lending large amounts of capital at a cheaper rates than, say, the non-banks. And they've got their risk profiles in place. They've got their APRA frameworks to work to. And the idea of a state form of guarantee to banks, you wouldn't consider in a more buoyant market.
But you wouldn't need to consider.
We are in a housing crisis. And so I think that's where this type of policy for here and now is actually quite important to be considered.
I think I'd correct you on one word there. You suggested that we're not in a buoyant market. We are in a buoyant market. It's just that the risks involved in this market are not demand risk. It's not sales risk. It's supply and delivery risk. That's the issue. And that's tied up with financing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's bring it back to Montreal Commons again. Mm-hmm. So you needed to get about half of the 39 apartments pre-sold. It took you how long?
6-7 months.
6-7 months. Okay. And in that time, costs started escalating?
So we got caught at a really tricky stage, and you and I are actually working on an advisory package for another client at a similar time.
In Como?
And our apartment project, the one you and I were working on, plus actually 2 others, I think it was 2021. From the period of early 21 to late 21, we were getting multiple tenders coming in that we were across at our OP's office, but also hearing through QSs were coming in at just wild numbers. And the first 2 or 3, we thought, oh, well, it must just be a blip. But then more and more were coming in, and it was just like, what is going on? So we found ourselves in a difficult position where we actually had sold enough to commence construction, but then the construction price, through no fault of the builder, had jumped substantially.
What are we talking?
20s, 30s, 40%.
That would have been your whole margin.
Your margin's going in at maybe 15%.
Probably the whole profit.
Oh, it's the whole thing. So it's your margin, and if you accept no margin, of course, you wouldn't, plus the bank wouldn't fund it. And if you somehow miraculously got the land for free, the job was still unviable.
And that was then?
Yeah, correct. So we worked really closely with our buyers, and we went back and we were actually pretty open with them, saying, look, there's been some pretty serious construction movement here.
The cost to build your home has gone up?
Yeah. They were, in the main, really supportive. We were very upfront with them as to the challenges. We worked to get as many construction efficiencies to pare things back. The board took a big haircut in terms of the margin wasn't huge to begin with, but to bare bones, but not to the point where it was unbankable, because of course, the project would have fallen over at that point.
So you went to the buyer's cap in hand and said, look, we can't build this thing unless you guys can contribute a bit more in terms of prices.
Yeah, pretty much. As it stands, happy to release all your deposits.
Yep.
The job's not proceeding. However, if everyone can basically chip in, then we can get going.
Okay, so at that point in time, we're in 2021. Costs are still escalating by the day. You guys have said, look, we need an extra, what was it, 20, 30, 40 grand, something like that, per apartment. Not material, but still something that people would have to go back to their banks with and check their budgets.
Substantial.
Yep. And then you've gone back to Northerly and said, oh, okay, well, we've got some more money now. What's your price again?
Yeah, pretty much. And so we're able to work really closely with Northerly, review the design, look at where there's some more efficiencies, look at where we could share some risk, look at some procurement strategies. Can we buy some things cheaper? Can we buy some things earlier and the like? And we're able to get it across the line to commence construction.
Okay, so when did you start?
Late 21, but proper mobilisation was early 22.
So I remember seeing that photo of you with the groundbreaking, with the shovels. It's an exciting time. It's a proud time, right? You show this stuff to your grandparents and say, hey, look what we're doing. You had Northerly there, you had some dignitaries there. And I remember at the time looking at it thinking, good on you, man. There won't be many other people than you at this point in time getting this off the ground. A lot of people will be looking at you with pride and with the satisfaction that you've been able to get it on. But also a little bit of trepidation that Northerly, which is a good builder, signed on probably with a lot of value engineering to get this thing through, probably taking a bit of a haircut themselves because they want to do the right thing and get this thing through as well. And they probably wanted some work, given there wasn't a lot of work going on in the apartment space at the time. A little bit concerned, going, geez, I really hope these guys get through to the end and don't become another Pindan. Was that a concern of yours at the time?
Look, Northerly operating for a long time. They're very solid. There's a close relationship there. So specifically to builders, look, no in relation to Northerly, but more broadly,
we saw a lot of builders go under whilst you got this thing built.
We weren't to know how much tougher it was going to get. We all thought it was pretty bad at the time, but we're going to come out of it.
I guess you were looking at it at the time thinking, we've signed a pretty fair deal here. I'm pretty sure they'll be okay. I'm pretty sure that costs will probably steady soon.
Oh, sure. And look, they've come out of it and they are okay. So the proof's in the pudding there. But look, moving into construction, there was a lot of challenges. And I think unless you're already in, it's very difficult. You've got rates jumping all over the place. Your brick rates, steel rates were jumping up like monthly. Unless you placed orders and landed some materials at one point, then there'd be a 10% escalation the next day. So it was very challenging. The supply chains more recently have settled down. It's really the just acute skilled labour shortage that is doing all the damage at the moment. The builders and the subcontractors I talk to and deal with, and also throughout other property council members in a similar position, subcontractors are very hesitant to be pricing new work, particularly if it's not going to start for 6, 12, 18 months. The materials, there's a bit more certainty there, so there's less volatility, there's less markup to cover that volatility. It's the labour piece that is of most concern. both in terms of, to an extent, what is my labour going to cost, what are my workers going to cost in 12 months' time, but also, am I going to have that team? There's just multiple stories of subcontractors winning a good amount of work with a good margin and just happy to sit tight for 12 months, but then the following month, half their team gets poached by a competitor.
All the mining industry.
And all of a sudden, what is a good, well-run business.
12-man bricky team is now 3.
Just really in trouble. So I think there's a lot of that, a lot of builders, contractors, stakeholders across the board have run into real trouble the last few years. I think that hesitation continues. And so from a current day tendering point of view, again, that's where often we're seeing large volatility in our tenders coming in. There's, I guess, a less of an ability to provide a fixed contract, or at least a mostly fixed contract.
That caused a lot of concerns for developers, right? Because if you're going into a development, and I mean, let's just use apartments, for example, which is futile right now. You know, my land's going to cost me $4 million. The build, is the build going to be 15 or 20? No one knows. The builder can't tell you. You can't use experience recently because you haven't done one for a while. And then you look at your revenues and go, well, I guess my revenues would work if they were at X amount, but we haven't actually seen any data in the market within 20% of that. So I can't really use hope money to expect that, and the bank's not going to fund it on hope money either. We're probably not going to be able to get pre-sales 20% above market prices right now. So I guess I'll just leave that feasibility in the bottom shelf.
Correct. And the job doesn't commence. So,
and that's like 100 projects in Perth.
It's about 80% at the moment. Property Council did some research to members last year and indicated that it was about, I think, 70%. And I think there are a number across industry that sort of scoffed at that suggestion. It's turned out to actually be an underestimate of reality. So, look, we're in this position now. Again, we're looking at a housing shortfall over the next 3 years out to 2027, about 25,000 homes. And that's on future numbers. The social housing wait list, I think...
30,000 people for about 20,000 houses.
And we've got 0.4% rental vacancy, which is effectively zero because you're dealing with margins of error at that point. So we all thought there'd be a bit more relief at this point. And so you really need to look at some of the fundamentals of West Australia's migrant intake. I believe the overall number, so for this calendar year, I think it was 60,000. Of that, there's about 2,500 of skilled migrants.
Let's take a second to recognise this, right? People talk to me on the radio every week saying how we need to stop migration. The issue is not migration. The issue is that not enough of the migration is actually helping us in any way. And when you think about those numbers, you're right, Luke, 60,000 people came into our state last year from overseas origins. 2,500 of those came on skilled migrant visas because that's all that the federal government allowed.
Yeah.
How do you have a policy like that when you know that the issue lies therein? The issue is that we have 60,000 people coming in, of which only 2,500 can help with the problem. If we had 60,000 people coming in and 25,000 of those are helping directly with the problem, we're probably not in the position we're in right now, are we?
We'd be coming out of it well and truly. And these policies obviously take years to flow through, and they've now flowed through. There is an acute shortage, which no listener will be surprised to hear. I think it's about 30,000 shortfall in construction workers in WA right now.
And we're letting in 2,500 a year.
Yeah, so it's about 3%. It's very odd that that's a policy setting for what, from a federal state point of view, there now seems to be a real understanding there is a problem. Lots of work being done and lots of good work being done, but some of these, you sort of look at these policies and think, oh, that just appears to be a bit of a disconnect.
Well, they're counterintuitive. Why have we been letting in students willy-nilly for years who aren't helping the problem at all? They're actually creating the problem, but capping the migration of people that would be part of the solution to a minute number in this state.
Yeah, I think every sector is important. The universities would say, well, don't reduce our student intake. School teachers, doctors, nurses. These are really important breakup of the migration. But for what is, I think, broadly now acknowledged as a state and national
the number
crisis,
one problem.
People sort of say, well, just reduce migration overall because there's nowhere for people to live if they come here. It's like, okay, well, that's sure, but it's not going to be zero. And yes, the people that move here will take up houses, but like you say, it's more of a case of it's not the overall number changing, it's the percentages within that. And we have to work out of this problem. We can't stick our head in the sand. We have to bring in more workers. By all means, train any and every young and middle-aged or whatever citizen in terms of a new trade and apprenticeships, by all means. But it takes 3 to 4 years to complete an apprenticeship. And, you're talking about a relatively small number of apprentices. So by all means, more funding, more encouragement. Absolutely. But I think it's just really important that we acknowledge that that's not going to solve the problem.
We think about the way the state government's trying to solve this problem at the moment. There's a few policies they've put in place. One, they've got the infrastructure fund, the $80 million infrastructure fund, which essentially allows 10 grand per apartment for a developer to help subsidise the cost for them to deliver to market. People have suggested that it's been taken up and it's successful, but is it really making a big dent in the numbers? No, it's not. Richard Pappas was on here a couple of weeks ago saying that number needs to double. He's in the paper saying that number needs to double. I still think that's one of 20 solutions that's really required to make an actual dent in what's going on. Minister Kerry has just announced he's going to be spending $100 million on homelessness. Imagine if Peter Tinley, his predecessor, actually did his job properly and spent $100 million in social housing back in 2017, 18, 19, not only built assets that would be helpful for today, but also provided a foundation for a trade base that absolutely waned away in those years at the time, which would be there now to be building houses for us right now. Isn't it just confounding to look at the neglect that's happened in that space, that we're now literally throwing $100 million away to keep homeless people off the streets, when if we spent that 7 years ago, money would have been working twice as hard versus costs today, and those assets would be able to be assisting this population for decades to come.
With the benefit of hindsight, if there'd been that larger investment, then absolutely. I think from an infrastructure fund point of view, $10,000 per dwelling for strata developments is extremely welcome and absolutely helpful. As Richard pointed out, I think if there's the opportunity, at the moment, it can only go towards public utility expenses. So your development costs of Western Power, Water Corp. So it's kind of going straight back to government, which helps, but it is quite limited. If there's able to be an increase in the overall dollar amount plus what it's able to be used for, and it could cover other government fees and charges.
Department of Education contributions.
Yeah, I mean, we're hoping that comments from the Minister around public open space getting pared back can be delivered from a built form point of view, built strata point of view. That's causing its own challenges and causing stock to be placed on hold. But yes, in various forms, if the contribution could be increased and broadened, there's no silver bullet here, but it's an extra piece to try and get jobs up and running.
Well, there's only two ways this problem gets solved. Is that the market sorts itself out and we just wait until sales prices for apartments inevitably rise by another 30-40% to get to where they need for developments to stack up. So we just go, we're just going to let it happen and watch the inflation of housing and living costs go through the roof in Western Australia. That's one way that it will be fixed in years to come, right? Won't be now, won't be next year, won't be the year after, it'll be years to come. Or the government subsidises the bringing forward of this construction by making it cheaper for developers to provide that product directly to the market, and therefore providing a cheaper product, cheaper price point to the market. A lot of this, in my opinion, is on successive governments' hands for letting things get the way they are, not providing policy outcomes that have sustained a trade base we really need. And you say that it's good in hindsight. Okay, it's good in hindsight, but let's use that going forward. Let's never get in a position again where we're not building X amount of social houses a year for the future, not facilitating apprenticeships for young people for the rest of our future in Western Australia going forward. So we never get in this position again. Let's learn from it now and let's try and fix it as quickly as possible. It still doesn't seem to be happening at a fast enough pace. There's a lot of talk at a federal level and a state level, but not a lot of direct action on anything other than one or two of the 20 or 30 things that actually need to be in place straight away.
You've made commentary over the last 2 to 3 years pointing at some policy decisions generally that are going to lead to sharp increases in housing value because of diminished supply. And we're now seeing that. The housing growth rate last month was 2%. I think last 12 months is on track to be 18-20%. RE was forecasting 20% this year. So we're now seeing it. We were one of the most affordable capital cities in Australia. Unless action is taken rapidly, the diminished supply and increased demand
and diminished capacity for supply in the future.
Yeah, correct. It's only getting worse. The government's federal independent bodies come out recently and talked about the federal government's housing targets and really the challenges that faces with the underlying capacity of nationally, but also in Western Australia. So housing prices are rising, apartment prices are rising, and there's not a lot on the horizon as the builder or the developer to sort of say, well, there's going to be big changes here. So I think we'd expect to see some quite significant property growth for the next 12 months. And in terms of undersupplied market, I mean, it's hard to see where relief is coming from for the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, and some people will be rubbing their hands together going, oh, you beauty, my house price is going to go up. But at some point in time, this stops being an opportunity and starts becoming a problem for future generations. Our kids, you've got a 2-year-old and 8-month-old, you start to look at that and go, we're leading towards their minimum house price for a home being $1.5–2 million by the time. We don't need it to get to that position if we actually facilitate supply to meet the demand of our market. Right now, we listen to the future housing targets that are being set at the federal level. And really, we need about 3,000 homes a month to get built right now. That's what we require to match our population growth. We're approving half of that. In fact, less than half of that every single month.
And of that, 75% is houses and 25% is apartments. So the state government's targets, directions 2031, is 47% of approvals is infill.
You know, we've never met that since it was first put in place over a decade ago.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And we're tracking significantly under that at the moment. So
we're at about 30% at the moment.
So I think we'll continue to see supply in the urban fringe, because that's where it's sort of possible to build house and land.
It's where you get the least planning risk, because there's the least local government and local neighbourhood backlash.
Yep. And you're building one at a time. Apartments, you're building 40 or nothing, or 100 or nothing.
Construction
And so,
risk.
the thresholds are much higher in terms of getting it going. So, it's a real challenge. And I think there's a role for everyone to play in this. The private sector, absolutely.
Well, the private sector's not sitting on its hands.
No, for private sector,
Put it this way, if you're in the apartment sector, a lot of people are unwillingly sitting on their hands waiting for work to come up, because that's where their expertise sits, and it doesn't work. If you're in the land development sector, you're probably looking to get stuff moving as quickly as it can, because really the only limiter for you is your availability of civil contractors and developable, serviceable land, which is held up obviously by your Water Corps, your Western Powers and those infrastructure organisations. If you're in the infill sort of small scale space, it's really patchy. You know, when we look at triplexes, townhouse developments, nothing really stacks up unless you're really in the high-end space and you can just ask stupid numbers for a great product. Otherwise, if you're down in the Morleys, Duncraigs, your Padburys, your Coolballups, your Belmonts, it doesn't stack up. The numbers don't work. Not because sales prices haven't risen substantially, they have, but because construction prices, because of our lack of supply of labour, continue to rise well faster than sales prices do. If we can, let's tie it back again to Montreal Commons as the case study. If you had been sitting on that land since you bought it in 2019, you weren't able to get it to work at the time, get funding at the time in 2021 to start, and we're now in 2024. Construction costs have risen about 60% now since you would have done your first feed or so in 2019. Would there be $1 in it right now, even with today's sales prices?
No.
So you wouldn't get funding from a bank. You certainly wouldn't have your board sign off to develop a loss-making project.
We've invested next door and we're looking at a townhouse development.
And is that going to stack up at the moment?
We're looking to get it going later this year. There is value in that. But I guess as a live example, we're looking at townhouses rather than apartment buildings.
Yeah,
so
because of that cost structure, we're reducing the density of that outcome just to get some product out of the ground.
The site had the potential for apartments as well, and we opted for townhouses. Not so that might change in the future, but really that's the path that's on. From Montreal Commons' point of view, if we got that land for $1, the project in today's market would not be viable.
So imagine what that looks like.
And that's in Fremantle.
Across the rest of the state.
Like you said, unless you're western suburbs, prices need to grow more, and construction, it's not so much the construction headline price, although that's an issue. It's the volatility.
It's the margin built in for the volatility.
Yeah, and it's just the inability for subbies and builders to give fixed prices, which is fair enough. And so that's as much the issue, because then it just creates more risk for everyone, the builder, the developer, and the bank. And that is as big a challenge. So I think, yes, labour shortage is probably a big part of the problem, but really there's so many other points of input that with collectively as stakeholders at a political level, at a state, federal government, a local state, federal government level support, that the private sector, there's more everyone can do. We've all know about lodging an application for an approval. It goes to one department, and then it goes to another department, and then it goes to another department, and due process is fine, but at times they can be quite siloed. And so you overcome one challenge at one point for a different one to come up at the next point, for a different one at the next point. So it's like, look, If you want it to be blue, we'll make it blue. If you want it orange, we'll make it orange.
We don't care.
Can you just tell us at the beginning what colour you want?
Yeah.
As a obviously off-topic example, that's often how it can feel. And then I think there's elements like the design review committees at councils, I think...
Can be overkill.
I had a project knocked back recently because we're trying to make some amendments to the facade, which is still a beautiful building, but it's not being supported, so we're having to relodge and it's a drawn-out process. And you just got to sort of think, well...
What's the priority here? The next Mona Lisa? Or roofs over people's heads?
Yeah, pretty much. It's what is actually most important. And I think if you got to look at what's the terms of reference of each input, such as design review committees, what may have been an acceptable threshold of design 3 years ago may not be now. But then equally, we got to empower the planning officers at local government to be making a balanced decision. And again, that's where a bit more potentially focus on the need for housing would come into play.
It's cultural, Luke. For every fantastic planner I've met in Western Australia that wants to be part of the solution, there is a local government planner whose first instinct is to control and not to facilitate. And that's a real issue. When it comes to all of our goals of streamlining the planning process, we can talk as much as we want to talk, we can put the policies in place, but if the culture is not to be a part of achieving an acceptable outcome, rather than controlling and creating hurdles simply for the sake of justifying roles, then we're continually going to be put in a position where every project is put under more risk, more time, more costs than it needs to. For what? Really, for what outcome here? What are we trying to achieve in Morley, in Bayswater, in Cannington, or even in Fremantle? At the end of the day, safe, energy-efficient homes for the future. Why do they have to have design review every single time? Why do they have to have arts contributions? Where is that art contribution going? Why do they have to provide public open space contributions when there's a park across the road that we're all supposed to share? Why are we providing Department of Education funds when the schools have already been built? All we're doing is shifting government costs to the end user of a new apartment at the same time as trying to tell the new apartment buyer that this compromise in their living standards is actually a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, every contribution is an important factor at play, but in isolation, you add it all up for the project recently where the approvals process added a net additional $80,000 per dwelling to that project. So that project's now challenged. And you really have to ask, well, hang on a second, is that the way it should be? Do we want to inhibit supply? Do we want to add past that cost onto the end user? Or do we want to be looking at how we can encourage and streamline approvals through?
Let's finish the case study on Montreal Commons and we'll get to that delivery and handover side. It only happened recently. What was the experience?
Yeah, so we've managed to reach completion with that, which is excellent. And we've now most of the way through our settlements of the apartments. The residents are starting to move in, which, as well as getting to the end and getting revenue back on the door, is just such a rewarding phase. You work so closely with your buyers to see them move in, to see them using the building. We've got a great little all-day cafe wine bar, Montreal Local on ground floor. If you're in the area, check it out. Great wine and pizza.
Very good.
It's such an important part of the building, part of the community. And look, overall, residents are just so pleased to be able to move into the building. So I think from a project management point of view, it's just so important to work closely with your buyers, work closely with the builder in terms of the handover phase, and really be involved with your inspections leading up to before the buyers come in. Really try to do the hard work before they got there. So your buyers aren't walking in and seeing things that obviously we'll be fixing up. Try and nip that stuff in the bud early, and then just a lot of communication. We obviously had a few delays with getting to settlements. In the main, the buyers weren't loving it, neither were we, but were understanding. Our communication was key to that. So, yeah, from a project management point of view, there's some of the key factors to be mindful of. But getting in is really rewarding. And we've now got this beautiful building that the residents are enjoying. We can look back on and just be really proud of our involvement in that project.
Well, mate, hats off to you. I'm extremely proud of you. I've been here by your side watching this thing from the day you acquired it 5 years ago to being able to see you finishing it. And it is a massive accomplishment and you should be very proud to achieve what you've achieved. Not the project possibly that you thought it was going to be from the start, not the outcome, but it's certainly something that will hang on the wall for years and a legacy you've created for tens of families and hundreds of families going into the future. When we talked to stage 2 and you mentioned that you would have ideally liked that to be a copy and paste of Montreal Commons number 1 and you've moved to townhouses just to try and see if you can make it stack up. I want to offer some solutions here, and we've spoken quite deeply about what solutions would look like for the state government that doesn't include oh, let's just wait for prices to rise to make it work because nothing else seems to be possible. Let's peel that back. Let's think really openly. Anything is possible about if you didn't rely on prices rising, what could help stage 2 be a feasible apartment development, even though we're so far back right now in terms of the bottom line as it is?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of things we've touched on, I think there's been some good policy movements. I think there's more that can be done. And just generally peeling back the layers of inhibitors. Like it really does feel at times every stage can be
you're up against it as a
bit of a struggle, and
yep.
it's yes, there's some real big factors in the mix, but a lot of the time it's death by 1,000 cuts. You add up the cumulative effect of the costs, the delays, the challenges, and you don't invest. Your investors don't want to invest, and that's understandable. So I think peeling back the layers generally.
So this is a planning side of things and a taxation side of things?
Yeah, look, there's a bit more the private sector can do, but really at a local and state government level, I think that's where a lot of good work has been done, but more can be done. And I think in line with that, a more broadening of a better supporting infill. I think, we look at our strategic planning documents like Directions 31, and just we're so far short of that.
We're failing.
We're failing, and we are now seeing the very real outcomes of that. And so I think continue to increase the support, both in terms of policy, but just as a mentality, as a collective. There's so many touch points in delivering infill, and every stakeholder has a really important part to play in that. And I think just lastly, I think one of the big factors we talked about is migration. So
let's be direct about this. Let's be really pinpointed here. 2,500 people came into the state last year to help solve our problem. What number do you think that really needs to be every year?
Look, there's different estimates around. Currently, the shortfall is about 30,000 construction workers in Western Australia. So we are undersupplied now. The Property Council forecast of the next few years out to 2027 is a further deterioration in that of a 24,000 shortfall in dwellings. So it is substantial. Here's lots of funding at state and federal level. Hopefully there's some more announcements in the upcoming state and federal budgets.
What if we just had a special visa opening up for a certain time for the next 2 years that was 30,000 people strong, right? That's how many places were available. And you've brought this idea to me before. They are only allowed to work in residential construction in Western Australia.
Yeah, I mean, other countries deal with it. There's lots of people that want to work in Western Australia. We are a country where, one of our big problems is we have too much money. Other countries have other problems. So yeah, look, we're in a crisis. I think we need to be looking a bit more broadly, and there needs to be a higher degree of urgency around this. Why can't we have a subclass of license that says, right, you got a 3-year construction visa for Western Australia, and you're restricted to working in residential construction, and it's time limited.
Yep. And
it's 3 years. And so as we come out the other side and we do replenish supply, we can wind that back. And so all these apprentices we've trained that come online 4 years actually have a job.
And they want to stay.
And want to stay.
And we build the industry back.
It's a short-term measure. Why can't we look at these things? These are within our control and our capacity.
Is it a political thing, Luke? I know you probably don't want to get political, but it's been a long time with Labor governments protecting local unions and local construction rates, and it seems like there's a high correlation between the increasing cost of construction, the input costs of that, and really a protectionism of local industry that isn't serving us right now. That if there was enough people, sure, that'd be fine. But it doesn't seem that we've got the capacity locally to solve this problem without the only answer being, well, sales prices have to increase by 30% because there's nothing we can do about construction prices.
I'm not around the table. I can't say where the exact roadblocks lie. All I can say is the outlook, where is relief coming from? And really that only leaves one option, house prices going up. It just seems very odd that the migration numbers would be what they are at, given the acknowledged crisis we're in. And I think every level of government, but particularly at a federal, but then further at a state level, yes, migration is in the federal domain and nothing is easy and you can't click your fingers, and I appreciate that. But we proved during COVID that we can overcome massive crises. It's within our capacity. We are saying we're going to, yet on the ground, things are getting worse. And so there needs to be more urgency. There are things we can be doing. As to why they aren't happening, I'll leave that for others to comment on.
Final question. Imagine Montreal Commons, but it's in Cannington. Cannington sales prices, similar construction prices because it's not that different. and Cannington acquisition price of land wouldn't be that different to what you paid, to be frank, in Fremantle. Could that get off the ground in the next 5 years if things continue the way they're going?
If we can't get off the ground now, and it's going to deteriorate. So as an example, we just looked at an apartment site where the average apartment sale value is about 10,000 a square metre, and that wasn't viable. Even at 12, 13, it still wouldn't be.
And you're thinking in Canning Vale it's more like 6 or 7, probably.
Correct. So on current inputs, the cost of an apartment in Canning Vale will need to at least, probably 50%. For apartment developments at scale, there'll always be one or two popping up, but at scale actually happening. So it's huge. And that's why we see the concentration of apartments in the western suburbs. And the majority of few that are getting up, it's a lot of the developers have their in-house construction businesses. So it seems to be more of a trend across the industry. But I think it's really important that we are able to sort of have a bit more of a balanced market at the moment. To your question, out of interest, you'd probably have these stats, possibly around, say, Armidale, where property value increases over the last 2 years.
Well, in the last 2 years, Armidale has increased about 45% from a cost base that is below the cost of replacement, which is the reason it's increased that high.
Yep.
Imagine getting a 10-storey apartment development in Armidale up in the next decade.
Even just a 3 to 4 infill around the town centre, which is where people that work in the shopping centres and the like in the town centre would happily want to live.
You can't imagine it, can you? Looking at the fees.
If anyone asked me, I'd say look elsewhere, and that's purely based on median housing price. Unless you're able to sell the apartments for probably close to 14,000 a square metre, and you've got a builder more or less lined up, there's not a lot of value in looking at apartment developments at the moment.
That's, I think, the stark reality from the last developer in Perth to actually get an apartment development finished that the state government needs to really take on board is that...
There are others underway.
Well, let's name them. We've got Elysium from Celsius. We've got Finbar putting up Queen's Gardens.
Edge
is putting up Scarborough. Tim Willing's finishing a
one.
couple off. Looking to start a couple around East Perth. I'm counting that on one hand, Luke.
Yep. And of those...
We really need both of our hands and feet to be full to start solving this problem. We need everything through Como that's been approved, a whole bunch through Applecross that's finishing off. We didn't mention the couple in Applecross that have been finished off. But...
Yep. And the amount of builders that are, open to looking at it,
one hand.
You could equally count on one hand, which kind of points to the challenges. So we're a capital city. Yeah, it's just really unusual times. Even back with the last proper boom, 04, 05, 06, 07, we saw a big jump, about 20-30% increase in construction prices. But then we saw labour move from East Coast. You remember all the New Zealanders moved over and were here for 3-4 years. So construction prices jumped, but builders were still tendering. Things were still happening. It just feels this time that it's really starting to grind to a halt. We got to work through this. It's within our capacity. We're an entrepreneurial state, but we got to get on with it.
Luke Parker, Managing Director of OP Properties. Thank you so much for coming in, being so open and candid today. I'm hoping a lot of people listen to this all the way through. Thanks
Trent.
Thanks for the chat.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!